we talk about the range of issues the center looks at, addressing race issues in the workplace, gender equality, mental health, and then things like hybrid work and flexibility and stuff, these things are so interconnected. I mean, if you moved, to a remote workplace, what does that do for gender equality? What does that do for women's advancement? What does that do for mentoring programs and things like that? Do those things still exist?
Can businesses make the world better? They certainly have an impact on our quality of life, especially inside the workplace. For this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Brad Harrington. He's a research professor at Boston College, and he's the director of the Boston College Center for Work and Family. Brad spent almost 23 years helping employers really enhance the employee experience. He helps them increase employee productivity and also improve the quality of employees' lives. And the center he directs provides really cutting-edge research on a range of topics, from diversity in the workplace to mental health to inclusion for LGBTQ individuals. And all this research is available to the public. We discuss the ways that business often drives cultural and social change and the important role that progressive businesses often play in leading societal change. Brad provides some really invaluable insights into the workplace that impact both employees and employers, things like remote and hybrid work schedules, and the growing impact of artificial intelligence, and a lot more. So please take a second, if you would, to press that subscribe or follow button. That really helps me immensely. And enjoy this conversation with me and Dr. Brad Harrington. Hi, Brad.
Hi, Debbie. Nice to
How
see
are
you.
you? Nice to see you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
It has. I was thinking the other day about when we met, or how odd it is how we met, because we went to the same college at Stonehill College
Mm-hmm.
a couple of years ago, and
Mm-hmm.
then but somehow in that very small school never met each other and
No,
didn't meet until like a year and a half ago. Which actually I
exactly.
don't even know how that happened, but we found each other on Facebook or something, or
I think so.
yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah.
think
So.
we had mutual friends, I think, and you popped up and you were doing really interesting work. I remember that, or had a career of doing interesting work. And yeah, and I thought to myself, this person went to Stonehill College. I never
Yeah,
saw
so
her.
funny.
Then I realized that you had transferred at some point. So
Yeah, yeah.
explain.
Well, so then I came out and spoke at your class in Boston College, and finally got to see the Boston College that I really wanted to go to. But boy, so since then you've certainly had a lot more schooling though. Then you went on to Boston College to get your
Yeah.
master's
I,
in, what was that? Organizational
well,
psychology
it was actually in counseling psychology, but I
or
focused on
counseling.
the industrial sort of electives, and then got a doctorate. Well, I spent then 20 years at Hewlett Packard doing human resource work in the U.S. and in Europe, a lot of global jobs and global roles, which were great in the sense that they allowed me to, to see and experience a lot of
Yeah.
parts of the world. But they got less interesting as I was married and then having children. All of a sudden, being in China when our kids were 3 years old didn't seem so
Oh,
much fun anymore, right? So,
oh, I didn't
but
know you were in China. I knew you're in
well,
Ireland,
not
but
I wasn't
yeah,
living in China, but I used to
yeah,
go to
but
work
traveling.
there, and Japan and Australia and Europe.
Yeah, I see. I
But
see.
the travel just got to be
Yeah.
a bit much when we were raising young kids. So that's
Hmm.
when, about 15 years into the career with HP, that's when I decided to go back and do my doctorate at Boston University
Oh,
in
oh,
human.
I thought you went right through. So
Nope, nope. I was one
plot
of those.
thickens.
Yeah, I was one of those people who, when I walked in the classroom, everybody must have thought I was the professor, and I'm like, no, I'm just a student because I didn't finish my
Well,
doctorate.
now you are a professor, so
Oh,
yeah. So
yeah,
and you run the
yeah.
Boston College Center for Work and Family, right? Yeah. So I mean, I can't. And then with your work at Hewlett Packard, I can't imagine anybody who would be better suited to have this conversation today about life in the workplace and how to make it better and how to
Mhm.
improve it for employees. That I guess by reading, and we'll talk about these reports that you put out, but it does look like people are struggling more lately, or more in recent years, like with mental health and
Definitely.
you know
Definitely. Yeah. Since, I mean, the mental health stats in the United States were going in a not so good direction up until 2019 anyway. And then
Yeah.
COVID really, all of a sudden it went from sort of a gradual incline into a very, very steep incline
Mm.
when it came to COVID. And so we saw even in workplace, we saw our episodes of, anxiety, depression,
Mm.
even suicidal ideation, all that stuff kind of increased by a factor of 3 to 4. And so,
Wow.
yeah, when I often say that in 2015, I think, we'll focus on all kinds of things related to the employee experience and how can we make, the employee's experience in the workplace as positive and meaningful as possible. And also, what are the things that detract from that and are problematic? And I think in 2015 was the first time I sort of said we should have a conversation about mental health because
Mm.
we haven't discussed that much. And it was seen as sort of a, gee, yeah, that would be a nice thing to discuss. And we had some companies talk about what they were doing, but it was seen as very much of a over there kind of issue and not one
Well,
that was
it
very
wasn't.
mainstream
Yeah.
at all. And now, if you talk to even, well, certainly chief HR officers and even CEOs during the last couple of years, they would say that was one of their major concerns, not only
Mm.
workforce concerns, just organizational concerns that the episodes and the incidents of mental illness had been on such a dramatic increase. So,
Well, and is it hitting a peak and coming down, or is it still really high as far as you've seen?
as far as I've seen, it hit a peak and has plateaued. Um,
Really?
yeah, but
So it's a reflection of society. Is that all we're seeing, or has the workplace changed and become more difficult?
The workplace in the U.S. has always been, challenging. Even people with
Yeah.
good jobs know that, that there isn't the kind of long-term commitment to their careers that there once was in the United States. And
Mm-hmm.
and if they do lose their job, they don't get the kind of generous severance packages
Right.
they would get if they were working in Europe. So that's always been, this idea of job insecurity has always been something that's been problematic. Toxic workplaces, lack of health insurance, lack of sick days, all those things around workplace policies or workplace culture play into that. But the thing that really has struck now is if you think about the employee population and how diverse it is today.
Yeah.
If you look back on COVID, well, COVID created a set of physical concerns about physical well-being that obviously had knock-on effects for
Right.
people's mental health. They would send their kids off to school, or they would be forced because they were essential workers to get into the workplace, and yet they were like worried the whole time about what if I get sick, what if I make my kids sick or my parents sick or
Oh,
whatever it might be.
terrifying.
Then
Yeah.
you say, okay, so that concerned anybody who was a working person and certainly any working parent. Then if you add on to that the fact that daycare centers and schools closed and stayed closed in many
Yeah.
cases for 18 months, then all of a sudden there was a caregiving crisis where,
Right.
and it fell unfortunately mostly along gender lines that women were much more likely to have to pick up these, you know, not just additional, but
Definitely
dramatic.
fell on gender
Yeah,
lines. That was so
right.
interesting.
Right. And
Yeah.
then, and so women were not only doing full-time caregiving, but they were doing homeschooling as well as trying to get
Yeah.
their work done.
Yeah.
And
This is
that,
all there's no mystery here, in other words, right?
no,
I
well, I mean,
mean,
I think there's a lot of external factors that have really have led to
hmm
it. But then if you look at something like race and what the black population went through after the George Floyd
yeah.
killings and so forth, there was a whole, there's an incredible amount of angst and insecurity around those issues. And now,
hmm
most recently, if you look at women, you say, okay, now all of a sudden there's the right to choose has sort of been taken away in many states, and so that's caused a lot of consternation. And if you think about LGBTQ people and you look at what's going on state after state in the United States, they're threatening LGBTQ individuals' rights, and so you know, and we won't even talk about the political climate, which is so
Right.
divisive. And so,
Because this is only an hour show.
no, I know, but I
But
mean, if you look
no,
at
I'm
yeah,
right. This is
no,
the
if you look
issue.
at if you look at the combination of those issues, it's no wonder
Yeah.
there's a mental health crisis.
Right. Right. And then you add the workplace. So yeah, that was really a good summary actually of why people are struggling. But
Yep.
well, and I know you work mostly with progressive companies, pretty much, don't you?
Yeah.
So you're kind of seeing the organizations that are really trying to address these things probably more than more workplace
Yeah.
settings where there's literally almost no effort being put out for equality or for
Yeah.
new working fathers or all those
Right.
kinds of things.
Right.
Well, I mean, so I really what if we're, because the show is about how we change the world, how we make the world better. It's like how our in the workplace, it's like how do we make it better for every working human, regardless of where the workplace is? How do we make it less stressful and more rewarding?
Yep.
How do we make it fun again? Which I'm not
Mhm.
hearing a lot about fun at work these
Mhm.
days, which is
Yeah.
maybe the biggest problem of all. And
Yep.
then I guess how we honor every person as who they are and what they show up with, what they're
Mhm.
bringing to the table, and how we really and truly honor and value that.
Mhm.
And it seems like those are kind of some of the ways that we can make the workplace great again. I don't
Yep.
know when it was at its best, but you've been in it for, let's say, 40 years. If you look at your 23 years at Boston College and your 18 years at Hewlett Packard, you what have you seen? What trends have you seen just personally?
Yeah.
Just
Well,
more.
yeah, I mean, I was blessed when I got out of my graduate program here at Boston College to join HP, and I hardly realized how great a reputation they had as a people-oriented company.
Makes a
Um,
difference.
yeah, and I mean, back in those days, they believed in flex time way back then, long before other organizations had
Mm,
thought about the idea. And they were very employee focused, had great benefits, had a real strong commitment to job security, and that if you came to that company, you had a job for life. And that was a kind of there was
wow,
sort of that
that's
idea of
really
yeah, I mean, it was a
different.
very family oriented
Mm-hmm.
organization, not very hierarchical at all, and one that really
Hmm.
encouraged sort of openness and an open door policy for employees to always feel like they could seek out somebody if they had a problem or a concern. And even that company, which has changed 180 degrees
Has
since
it?
since the days I was
Yeah.
there. But I mean, even in that company, though, it was mostly an organization that was set up for men. It was populated with engineers, and so it was an engineering environment. You know as well as I do that women go into engineering at much, much smaller rates than men do, and so it was a great
I do.
organization for men to work at. But as and mostly white men, to be honest with you, because
Mm-hmm.
engineering schools were also predominantly white. And so over the years, what I've seen, is obviously, and the reason the Center for Work and Family exists was, okay, now we've got all these women coming into the workplace in professional and managerial roles. What adjustments or adaptations do we need to make in
Mm-hmm.
order to make the workplace more amenable to them when that most workplaces and their policies were really set up with the idea of it was a man that was going to be
White
working
men.
and they had a stay-at-home spouse, and
Yeah.
so these
What's
men
the?
didn't have to worry too much about the home front. And so that was the first thing, and then obviously so many diversity programs came into play, and at the same time a lot of organizations stepped away from the idea of long-term job security, and they started saying, well, we're going to have massive layoffs. And if you think about the dot-com bust in 2000. You think about the meltdown that occurred in the economy in 2008 to 2010, and even most recently, you see tens of thousands of people being laid off from companies that seemed insulated. The Googles, the Facebooks, the
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazon. So
It's been shocking.
you see a much. I think HP was always kind of a leader in terms of that people focus and that commitment to
Mm-hmm.
long-term job security. But now it's, you have somebody like an Elon Musk who comes into Twitter and his first overture is 50% of you people are going to be gone the day I take over this company. And of the rest of you, you better be committed to, 20 hours a day all
Right.
in, or we're not
Right.
in. And I mean, that
Yeah.
kind of, I'll call
That's
that,
like the
yeah, it's,
epitome of the
yeah,
cold heartedness. What do you
yeah,
call it? What are you going to say? You call it
yeah,
the what?
toxic leadership, that
Oh, yeah.
basically make people either feel like they're insecure or if they're going to work there that they better, give 120%. I think these are unfortunate trends in terms of management, and I don't
Yeah.
think it's led to anybody feeling more at home or at peace
Secure. Yeah.
in a workplace.
Well, so I was just trying to understand when you said that, like why HP that was so people focused and they've changed 180 degrees. Is that like, was it a financial reason or is it just literally I mean, were they not able to make the same amount of money or did they want to start making more money? Like, I'm just trying to figure out what changed this cultural
Yeah,
shift, the
there's a lot
mindset.
changed there. HP used to always participate in sectors, mostly in engineering technology sectors, obviously, and where they had really highly differentiated products that were, some people used to joke, oh, HP stands for high price, because the products were
Right.
always at the high end, but they
Yeah,
were also extremely good products and extremely
they
reliable
were.
products. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the
Yeah.
famous one was back in, the 90s. People used to, if they found out I worked for HP, they'd say, "Oh, I've got a LaserJet printer, and that thing never gives up on me."
Oh,
And
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 good
and think
calculators too.
calculators and
Yeah.
computer systems and medical.
Back
I
then.
worked a lot of my career in the medical business, so but it was always seen as like just a little bit better in terms of the
Right.
quality of the product, and that I think was coupled with we're going to be better to our employees, and we have a fundamental underpinning and philosophy of beliefs that were built by Hewlett and Packard, and they said that's what's going to drive this organization in
Yeah.
product and technology innovation and a workplace that's second to none. But I
Mm-hmm.
think what happened is over the years, some of the without going into the business strategy, some of the strategy changed and there was more convergence between the product lines and things got kind of a lot more cluttered. And they also picked up on some trends like they said, "Oh, why are we manufacturing in the United States? Let's move everything to China." And pretty
Right.
soon people became more and more sort of um, insulated
Ancillary.
from what's
Oh,
that?
well, I was going to say ancillary, like less of the decision making.
Yeah, I think the leaders became insulated from what was the thing that made this company great. And then, and they started to undermine some of the people practices that had made HP such an attractive employer and such a well respected one. And then in like 1999, not to cast dispersions on any one particular person, but they made a really strange decision. They had always had a promotion from within policy. And so everyone right up to the CEO had always come from inside the company.
Oh, the ranks.
And so they grew up in a certain culture and they went
Mm-hmm.
outside and they hired a woman named Carly Fiorina who
Oh,
ran
sure.
for
Ran for
president.
president, right?
Yep. And she was a disaster for the company.
Yeah.
And she
Yeah.
decided to acquire very, very large companies. And all of a sudden, she would purchase these companies that were enormous and they would change the nature of, the
Oh,
chemistry of the company. And
but the
so,
whole company followed, I mean, country followed because I don't know if they were following HP at the beginning, but everyone was more employee focused. And now it just feels like everything is dollars and cents.
yeah, it does. Yeah.
But still, you're working with these corporations that are trying to put in place protections for and opportunities for women, for LGBTQ, for you know every
The
every
color.
racial and
Yep.
ethnic group, and so I mean, it seems like there's at least um, a desire, or they're giving homage to it. I don't know if
Yep.
they're actually putting these things in place. So, but I mean, is your experience that these efforts are genuine or more just for show? And at least in
For
what
the
you've
most
seen.
part, the organizations that join us, Debbie, are people that really do believe it. They've drank the
Yeah,
Kool-Aid, to use a disparaging
yeah,
cliche, but they've
yeah.
sort of bought into the fact that their people really are their best asset, and that if they create a sort of a workplace culture, they're not only going to attract great young people, but they're also going to be able to retain folks who
Yeah.
are in the middle or later stages of their career. And so these are organizations that people look at and they respect them because they know that if you go to work for one of the big four, or you go to work for Bristol Myers Squibb or Eli Lilly or
Mm-hmm.
Prudential Insurance, whoever it is, that these are organizations that are going to be people oriented, and they're going to be trying to hire the absolute best people they can
Right.
out of colleges and business schools. And so when you work in an environment where they have a strong brand, a strong reputation, and they're known for hiring good talent, I think they are the people who say, well, if we're going to keep this good talent, we've got to be
Mm-hmm.
out there in front, and we've got to be the kind of employer people want to stick with. And so we've been lucky to work with 50, about 50 to 55 of these kind of organizations, and they're with a few exceptions, they're all great employers, and they seem very sincere in their efforts.
Mm-hmm.
They part of their sincerity is expressed through buying membership in our center and then sponsoring some of our research and so forth. So these are organizations that I think have it at the very least a commitment to, and I think most of them really do try to follow through with having
Mm-hmm.
values and workplace practices that reflect their desire to be great employers. The
Well,
only
I
thing I
hope
would
that.
say on the other side, Debbie, is, and this is one reason why I was a little concerned about being on your podcast, is we're working with a lot of haves, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
We're working with companies,
Sure.
the Goldman Sachs of the world and
Yeah.
Chevron and
Yeah.
people like that. And so one of the only hesitations I had to accepting your invitation was, we're doing good things and these employers are doing good things, but with the exception of their foundations or their community relations offices, a lot of the good things they're doing are for people who are, pretty privileged to begin with.
Well, I appreciate your saying that, and I totally agree. But I think as sometimes the largest corporations go, sometimes so goes the world. And
Yep.
so we were in this very people focused environment, like when you started at HP, and we seem to have crashed out of that. And
Mhm.
if the largest, I don't know if they're the largest 50, but this group that you're working with, if
Yep.
they're trying to shift that trajectory back in a people focused way, then
Yeah.
I'm I mean really, because business is, in my opinion anyway, is who sets the agenda for the world. That's who sets the social justice issues. I mean, the government can do law, it can legislate things, but it's really businesses. Like, I think something like 93% of the workforce works for profit businesses,
Mhm.
and so yes, we talk to nonprofit businesses, but most people are in a more for profit
Right.
world, and whatever they determine is so important for setting trends in the workplace.
Yeah.
But
And that,
well,
and that's the hope we have, Debbie, is that if these companies that are so well respected do things like this, and then people look at them and say, well, what's EY doing? What's, Goldman
right,
Sachs doing?
right.
What's IBM doing? If these kind of companies are setting the stage for, what is a good workplace or whatever it might be, then the hope is that other organizations will follow suit.
Well, if it's successful for them, then
Yeah.
it will be, probably.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the Center for Work and Family, because that's I don't know if there's many in the country. Are you a unique center? You're
I think,
located
yeah, we are unique in terms of when the organization was established 33 years ago, there were 10 founding companies that established it. And they basically said, we want you guys to be a bridge to link research and practice. Okay.
Oh,
So we'd like it if you do research. We'd like you to be informed about research so that you can inform us about what's happening. But the most important thing is don't think of yourself as a academic research center whose end goal is to publish research papers or get published in peer-reviewed journals, because at the end of the day that kind of research almost never sees the light of day with real practitioners in the
mm-hmm,
real world, quote unquote, as much as
mm-hmm.
academics hate referring it to the real world. But
It
um,
is what it is.
it is what it is. Yeah. And I would agree with you that, businesses really can be an enormous force for social good, and
Mm-hmm,
they can be enormous influences in terms of how things get done. I mean, oftentimes government or even higher education can look and say, how have businesses succeeded and what have they done and what kinds of, and we're usually, if you look at what's happening in businesses, it's usually 5 to 10 years ahead what's happening in, in,
yeah, it
in other
is.
sectors. I mean, whether that be
Yeah,
healthcare or whatever. I mean, it may be 30 years ahead of what's going on in academia, or maybe a century ahead. I don't know. But I mean, things that are just taking off now in healthcare settings or in academic settings, oftentimes are things that have been
yeah,
piloted and done by corporations for many, many years. So
yeah,
the hope is that there is some kind of trickle down effect to what we're doing, and
yeah,
we're
yeah.
helping these organizations do
Not
it
sure that
right
was
and
the
be
best
more.
choice of words, but because trickle down so rarely works
Right, right, right. Yeah,
in the real world. But
yeah,
yeah, but I think ideas can trickle down,
yeah,
and
yeah,
across and out and up and every other direction.
yeah.
So you start they put you together to do that, and but some of the reports that you write, like I was honestly pretty blown away. I was like, kudos all the way on these things, and I think they're open to the public. I mean, I can
Correct.
download and read the amount of information. So you pick, I don't know how, maybe you can talk about how you decide what you're going to study, but whether you're talking about working fathers and taking time off for the birth of their children and what it's like for their career. You go so in depth on the studies, at least that I've looked at, like
Hmm.
so much of the just first of all raw information and research that you've done,
Hmm.
and then what I love is that you go so in depth with guidelines and recommendations, and here's what you could implement, and anybody could take that and apply it to their own workplace. I
Right.
would think, because
Yeah,
there's
and
there's a
I mean,
wealth of information on your
well,
website.
thank you, Debbie.
Yeah,
So yeah, if you go to our website, which I'll just say what it is so that people know, it's
yeah, please.
www.bc, as in Boston College, .edu. and then just /CWF for Center for Work and Family. So
And I'll put the show notes. I'll put the
you'll
links
do
in the
that,
show
okay?
notes with everywhere. Yeah.
And yeah, the good news, I guess, about working with these well-heeled companies is they pay for all the research, and then we give it to
Oh,
everybody else for free. We don't tell
oh,
them that, but that's part of
they
our
might have caught on by now. I'm
yeah.
thinking.
Oh yeah. But we post virtually. There are some things that are members only because members have asked us to keep the information proprietary or keep it just amongst the membership. But
Hmm.
most of what we publish really is available for anybody. And so if you're a HR department, if you're a leader in any sector and you're interested in issues like how to support LGBTQ people, populations, or how to look at your women's advancement programs and how to develop and nurture employee resource groups for specific populations within your workforce. All of that stuff is free and it's all downloaded into PDFs. And so we would welcome any of your listeners
Yeah.
who are organizational leaders or HR leaders to take advantage of that.
I mean, they're actually just nice reading. Like it's not my topic, and I'm like, like it's really just an
Yeah,
interesting way to really look at what's going on in the corporations and just see
yeah.
how life is. But it does beg the question now that you say that they pay for the research. Do they influence the research? Because typically, when you want to see who paid for that
Well,
and how dairy is dairy good for people, you go.
yeah,
A lot of those studies are paid for by the Dairy Council, so
yeah,
obviously we've been misled.
yeah. Sorry if I disappeared from the camera. My computer said low power, so I wanted to
Oh, I
make sure.
appreciate that.
Okay. Yeah, no, one of the things we won't do is say, like we've been approached by sort of, the Dairy Foundation or whoever it might be, organizations like that. We've
Yeah,
been approached by them and said, oh, maybe you could do some research that would substantiate that formula is just, like they don't say it, but they definitely want you to lean in that direction, but we never accept that
yeah,
research. And the
yeah.
research that we're doing, corporations who are either sponsoring it or involved in it have never once said to us, would like to make sure that the results come out a certain way, or we hope you're
Hmm.
going to present this in a positive light.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
they have the choice not to share who they are. If we publish some piece of research that in some way cites them, if they say
Hmm.
we don't mind you citing that example, but we would prefer to stay anonymous, that's
Yeah,
fine. But no one has
yeah,
ever tried to influence us about,
yeah.
you know, if you spin it
Make us look good.
exactly,
Yeah, yeah,
don't do that. So
yeah. Well, that's good. I mean, I would think university would be a little bit immune from that too, but maybe not.
a
I
little
don't
bit. I
know.
mean,
Yeah, maybe not.
you'd be amazed how much research in universities is sponsored by corporations, and so
Yeah,
it's always just
as I was saying that, I was thinking because I just know a lot about the food research, and that's often done by ag schools and stuff
yep,
that have been influenced. So
sure.
definitely. Well, let's. So I want to actually not yet in a minute. I want to kind of delve into some of those reports because I think they're really interesting about trends that are happening in the U.S. and in some of those sectors, but. You just wrote this blog that was actually really interesting. I saw it on LinkedIn. I'm not sure if you put it in, published it elsewhere as well,
No.
but talking about how it's like with all the changes that we're going into with uh, hybrid work and remote work and all the different factors that are affecting the workforce, that the managers are like really under pressure. So it might be a good place to start with just talking about how management. And boy, it made so much sense once you said it that they're like the front line for
Yeah,
everyone. They're the connection to the
absolutely.
corporation for all these
Yeah. So,
workers.
when you ask for the difference between, the what an organization espouses versus what an experience, what kind of experience an employee actually has,
Mm-hmm.
it's great to hear that, oh, our CEO is preaching, the gender equality, and our CEO is
Right.
promoting flexible work, and our, CEO believes in this, that, and the other thing. But it's always a question of, well, how does that get experienced by people that are three or four levels or more down the hierarchy from
Yeah.
CEO? And a lot of that experience comes down to what is my manager, like, what does that person, do to foster my mental health? What do they do to invest in my well-being or my development, or what are the things they do to make sure that I have work-life balance? And the person that most people judge the culture by is the supervisor or manager they work for, because that's the person who dictates their experience as much as any kind of corporate culture or corporate policy. So
Yeah.
the point I was trying to make was just, a lot of these people are just being bombarded by an incredible range of issues that 20 or 30 years ago we probably wouldn't have been thinking about. Whether that
The managers are people
manage,
who are
yeah,
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 yeah.
whether that's how to deal with the Me Too movement, how to deal with harassment issues, how to deal with racial bias or unconscious bias, how to deal with you know people who are transitioning in the workplace, from one gender to another, or how people treat you know folks who are in same-sex marriages, and as you mentioned, hybrid work is a whole nother layer on top of that.
Yeah, it's a
And
lot.
you think of that and you think managers are dealing with some very, very complex issues. And not to sound politically incorrect, but I mean, sometimes a manager is going to trip and stumble when they say things because it's just overwhelming the amount of knowledge you need to have in order to be a good people manager these days. Um, we, we just published something a couple of months back on LGBTQ employees, and one of the things we did is we did a full page of definitions of terms. Gender
I
identity,
saw that.
transitioning. What, body dysphoria and cisgender. And you think to yourselves, I can barely, I'm studying these issues, and I can barely keep it all straight and know that I'm using the right terminology. How do people whose day job is to manufacture products or ship products or sell them or whatever it might be, how do those people keep all this straight and really make sure that they're in tune with all the complexities
It's
that they're working with in the workplace? It's
really
daunting.
challenging. It's
Yeah.
really challenging. I mean, it's just and like I learned the use of pronouns, which is now something in the workplace which
Right.
wasn't there before.
Right.
But like, and I have my sister's child is non-binary, trans non-binary, and so I've become really just I've had the personal experience of learning terminology and ways of being with them, and not saying my niece, saying my sister's
Mhm.
child and things like that. So I know how much that has taken because it is something that none of us were exposed to before a few years ago. But
Mhm.
one thing that their name is Finn, and one thing that they said is that I like something that would be a real life experience that a manager might have is that like when they're in college, and so it's nice that people go around and say what are your pronouns, like that's and it seems like that would be an inclusive thing. But they said like when you're in a group of 300 people in what might be a conservative school, like you're in a classroom, you don't know who you're outing
Right.
yourself to, and by saying that, so then they might lie and say, oh, they're she her rather than they them.
Mhm.
So that how would a like you would think that you were doing the right thing, right, by saying what are your pronouns. So it's very easy to trip up if you haven't been educated. So but it's not an HR thing anymore. It's a manager thing. It's
Mhm.
both, right? It used to be more
Yeah.
like, well, go talk to HR about that.
Right, right. No, it is a manager thing. And one of the things that's happened, at least in big corporations, is HR a lot of times now have decided that they want to keep their ratios as low as possible, meaning the fewer HR
Oh,
people we
really?
have, the better, right? So what have they done? They've centralized functions so that they could be more efficient. They've automated things, and they've pushed more back out to managers. So it used to be when you were in an organization,
Oh,
when I started with HP, you had a whole HR department right next door, right? And so
right,
you could
right.
walk into the HR department and say, I've got this issue, or I've got this employee. Can you help with this?
Mm-hmm.
Or can you take responsibility for at least getting them the assistance or help that they need? Now it's like, well, you can call a 1-800 HR number somewhere and
Why
3,000
are they
miles away.
doing? That's terrible.
Well,
Why are they
I,
doing that? It's a financial decision.
yeah, it really is a financial decision. So,
But I mean, it just feels very ill-advised because the managers, like you just said, first of all, we haven't even talked about the metrics. That they're making widgets or they're serving people. They're doing
absolutely.
that's their main thing.
Right.
But now you have a myriad of other social justice and social issues.
Yep.
It seems like that would be not something that a manager should be carrying.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
So,
mean, it's hard because on one level, the reason the U.S. economy is what it is because, they're continually thinking about how do we increase productivity and reduce, unnecessary costs and all that kind of thing. And so that's pushing on one level, and innovation obviously is in the mix there as well. But on another level, they're trying to say, well, how can we do that and still be people oriented? And it's a very difficult mix, and that just talks about how do we make the products and services in the most cost effective way possible and get them out to the end users as effectively as possible. But in the mix of that, there's all the day-to-day dynamics that occur in the workplace itself. And, a lot of managers have just been kind of thrust into dealing with these issues without necessarily having adequate training or support.
And are they struggling a lot? Like, are
Yeah, I
they?
mean, the burnout rate amongst managers is very high, and in some companies, and a lot actually, they're reporting that they're losing managers at 2 times the rate they're losing other employees because I think, it's
I
just
think this is
it's a
what
lot.
we're saying has to
Yeah,
be the reason. So maybe that will
yeah,
engender new changes back to HR, back to a focus of HR.
maybe, yeah.
Um,
Because it just, I mean, even just the switch to COVID and what was happening there, that was huge. I mean, all of a sudden, yesterday, 95% of
Tremendous.
your employees are in the building every day, and tomorrow, none of them are going to be in the building, or only those that are earmarked as essential. And so, they were either dealing with remote employees or they were dealing with essential employees who's putting their health at risk by having to come into work and trying to
Right.
motivate people who are nervous about their health and the health and well-being of their families. So even something like COVID created such a sea change in terms of what managers were grappling with. It was just amazing.
Yeah. I mean, that almost seems like the biggest sea change. Because have you done studies yet? I know you. I think I saw something on flexibility. Like, is this whole going hybrid or remote and all that? Have you done put out a research on that yet? Or
We've put out some
okay.
stuff on it. The problem right now, Debbie, is we can't. If you said to somebody, give me an assessment of exactly what's going on with hybrid or remote work or whatever it might be,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like what's the old analogy about touching an elephant? I forget how that works, but it's like
Yeah. Well,
depending on where.
everybody's touching it in a different place. You see it
Correct.
differently. Yeah.
Exactly. And if you said what's going on with hybrid and remote work, I would say pick a company or
Depends.
pick a sector or do, whatever, because the story is different. And I think we've had I
Mm,
mean, everything went flexible, everything went remote for a couple of years. There were some very conservative companies who said we're getting back to work ASAP, even though they didn't have to be in a in-person environment. They just decided that was
mm-hmm.
what the CEO thought was the
Right.
right thing to do. Others went dramatically out toward remote and said we're never going to change, we're going to stick with this. And most organizations went somewhere in between. And I
Right.
would say, if you ask me which way is the wind blowing right now, the wind seems to be blowing toward most organizations, if they went to hybrid, saying we'll stick with hybrid, but we expect you to be in 3 days a week, or we're trying to keep pulling you back into the office, and we're
Mm-hmm.
looking for ways to do that without necessarily making it a demand or a punishment if you
Right.
don't. But
But
we are
that's really
looking.
what they'd prefer.
They would prefer that,
Companies
but they
would
would,
prefer.
yeah, they would prefer people want to come back to the office at least
Yeah.
3 or 4 days a week in many cases.
I mean, we were talking before we came in line about community and how I was saying how I struggled so much being isolated during COVID, and I really am still craving the community. And it does feel like it's healthier for people to be in community, and
Yep.
certainly with their peers. And I'm sure everyone already knows this, but it just occurs to me how strongly a factor of mental health that might be, that if you're isolated at home and maybe you're not in a good situation at home for whatever reason, or trying too many kids or whatever, um, and that going to work is often, anybody who's gone back to work after being home is like, ah, it feels good to be back, you
Sure.
know, because
Yeah.
that's like, that's your social life, that's your community, and that's
Yeah.
your peer group, and not
Yeah.
to have that has to be affecting mental
Yeah.
health.
Oh, for sure. And I think, when we talk about the range of issues the center looks at, addressing race issues in the workplace, gender equality, mental health, and then things like hybrid work and flexibility and stuff, these things are so interconnected. I mean,
Right,
if you
that's
move,
complicated.
to a remote workplace, what does that do for gender equality? What does that do for women's advancement? What does that
uh,
do for mentoring programs and things like that? Do those things still exist? Do we committed,
mm,
and one of the things you do lose, and I don't care what anybody says, I think you do lose a sense of community. And I think, teaching seniors at Boston College, I have these kids who say, oh yeah, I got hired by Citicorp, and but my job is 100% remote. And you think to
yeah, it
yourself,
sounds awful. It
it
just
sounds
sounds awful.
terrible, right? And
Yeah.
like, oh, again, I'm going to be living in New York in like a a 600-foot apartment or
Box.
whatever it is.
Right.
It's,
Yeah.
and you think to yourself, a, that I'm not sure that's good for these people's mental health to be isolated like that. B, you have no way of really assimilating into the culture and really understanding on sort of a visceral level, this is what this culture is about, and see the relationships you probably need everywhere from learning to do the job effectively to being mentored in,
Mm-hmm.
your career. All those relationships don't happen in any way as naturally as they did
Mm-hmm.
20,
Or
10
at
or 20
all
years ago,
sometimes.
or at all. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, I'm of the age where I'm still old school, and I think, well, there was a whole lot to be gained by showing up in the workplace every day,
Mm-hmm.
including like if you move to a new area, like some of my students do, how,
Yeah.
your
Friends. Just
your social,
friends.
right? Absolutely, your social environment.
Yeah.
A lot of times in the early stage of your career, are formed or at least begun by forming relationships with people in the workplace, and so that being lost is really problematic. And there was a
I
book
think
that came
so.
out a few years ago that I thought was terrific on mental health in the workplace, and it was written by a professor. Jeffrey Pfeffer from Stanford Business School, and he said if there's two things you have to do in order to improve people's mental health and sense of well-being, he said one
Mm-hmm.
is give people more control over their jobs. So don't tell them how to do it, don't micromanage them, don't allow them
Mm-hmm.
flexibility to do the work in the way that
For
the place
sure.
time that's best. He said that gives people a sense of I'm more in control. And he said the second,
Agency.
right, exactly,
Yeah.
agency.
Yeah.
And the second thing he said is, make people realize they're in a community in the workplace, that there are so many positive things about working with colleagues, about developing friendships, about relationships
Mm-hmm.
with mentors and all that kind of thing, and just socializing that's just good for people. And so I think we've lost some of that in recent years, and it'll be interesting to see, I mean, a lot of people
Yeah,
are
it
fighting
will.
coming back, but I think, the hybrid isn't perfect, but I do think for most of us, if you had at least 1 and maybe 2 days a week where you could
At
have the
home.
plumber show up, or you could
Yeah.
attend the child's.
Or you don't have to get dressed and look
Correct,
nice and wear
correct,
good clothes and all that.
exactly,
Yeah. No.
exactly.
Yeah.
That
If you
that
have
can't
a
help but
setup
help
for it.
people. Yeah.
I
So
would think, but it's also a reflection of society because you just see so much generational difference, and it's one of the things I actually want to ask you about. But how people don't want to use the phone anymore. There's like this whole generation of people who don't want to call to order a pizza, for example.
right.
Like in the or to do something they really need to do, make a
Yeah.
doctor appointment. I'm seeing it more and more. I keep thinking it was an isolated person here or there, but it's a
No.
generation that doesn't want to communicate human to human. So,
Mhm.
or we're not allowed to because we get a machine answering, like the HR, like you said,
Right.
call 1-800.
Right.
So, yeah, I feel like we need to do everything we can to keep community rather than like remove the only few areas where it's kind of mandated in a way.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, yeah. I
s-
mean, there's been so much research done on social media and how that's changed the nature of lives for young people. And the
yeah,
one thing I would say, that it's like they date less frequently. They
yeah,
they don't go out socially as much. A lot of times they're doing things virtually, and obviously they're very distracted and easily distractible because they've got all these interruptions,
yeah.
from their machine, or all these distractions from their machine. And we know that stuff hurts their mental health, and yet it's the problem is I used to have a reading that I give folks called "Did Smartphones Destroy a Generation?" And it was written by a
Mm,
professor from San Diego State who's very well known, talking about generational differences, and it was all kind of assailing students, and young people for allowing themselves to do this. And then my students' reaction to that was, "Who do you think made all those machines?"
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah,
We're creating this environment and
yeah,
then
and then
blaming people for it.
exactly.
Yeah,
And then you blame
it's
people for
yeah,
for products that clearly are meant to be seductive, right? And they
right,
are seductive, and then you blame the
yeah,
people who are using it.
right.
Like, there's an addiction. If there's an addiction there, we created it.
I used to think that when people tell their kids you're so spoiled, and I think, well,
Yeah.
how did
Hello. Yeah.
that? I don't think they
Yeah.
spoil themselves. Yeah.
No, no, they
Well,
didn't.
speaking of generational differences, have you
Yeah.
seen yet? And I know it's really early on for like Gen Z, which is just like I think the 26-year-olds or the
Younger.
first of the and starting the oldest is
Yes,
26 going
exactly.
down to like 11,
Yeah.
and they're entering their workplace obviously at 26. And
Yeah.
has that been something you've studied yet, or that you've heard differences in that generation
We've done
Z
like
or
we've done
Gen
some
Z, I should.
secondary research there, but we haven't done any primary research. And I'll be honest with you and say I think the generation stuff is so overblown
Do
sometimes.
you?
I really do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
This. I remember one time reading somebody said, to buy this stuff, you have to swallow the assumption that just because people were born in a certain age, in a certain set of years, that
Mm-hmm.
they're necessarily going to be different than previous generations, and they're going to be more like their own generation. And those are two pretty big assumptions to swallow, and I'm not sure there's a lot of validity to
Mm-hmm.
most of it. We did a study on millennials a few years ago, which is the generation just above the Gen
Above it,
Z,
yeah.
and
Which they're
you know
getting up to their
they're in their
40s now.
30s and
Yeah.
40s,
Hitting
yeah,
40s,
now,
yeah.
and yeah, at the time they were like in their 20s to late 30s,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, there's a couple of things that we knew were different for these folks. Like one thing is they were raised in a time of technology, and smartphones have been around since about 2007, so these people have grown up with that, and so
Yep.
there is a whole different way of looking at technology and how it can be utilized. Second thing was different is career paths. We talked earlier about how companies became less people oriented, and millennials were accused of being disloyal because they jumped from job to job. Although again,
Oh,
who
yeah.
created the disloyalty?
Right.
Organizations
Yeah.
that weren't loyal to them.
Yeah.
And then there was, I think, a recognition that people that genders were becoming more similar, and I don't mean that about cisgender or transgender. I just mean that
Right.
this idea of the man is this and the woman is that, and
Right.
man,
And our roles, certainly.
the
Yeah.
roles were certainly starting to blur. And so we thought those things were different for sure. And the other thing with millennials was that there was a tendency to believe that they were lazy or entitled. And part of
Mm-hmm.
that was that they're not buying houses, they're not getting married, they're not settling down,
Right.
not having children. But again, there are a lot of factors that played into why they were delaying those
Of course.
decisions. And it
Yeah.
wasn't that they were narcissistic or whatever it might be. It was
Right.
simply that
It's real life
situation of
stuff.
right.
Right.
Yeah, and it was much more difficult to buy a house, and it was and you didn't have to get married in order to have a
Mm-hmm.
meaningful relationship and things like that. So
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of stuff that gets laid on generations is I'm not sure it
Mm-hmm.
always passes the muster of the
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, I guess it depends on how you're using that information too, because I think, I guess the way I've always thought of it is just that, like what you said, there's certain situation, there was a war, and then there was a lot of babies born after the war, and they were
Yep.
in this environment, and then the next one was in this environment, and so definitely I guess
Yeah,
I think of it more that way. Is it's just that they're influenced differently by society because boy,
right.
you go forward and this is another topic, but I know that I know you haven't done research on this because it's so new, but AI and how that's going to affect businesses. And are they talking? You just had a roundtable last week, I think you said, right? And I don't know if that was with all of them, but is that
Yeah.
is that front and center in terms of where we're headed with the workplace? It just has to be. It's so big. I don't even know where you start to talk about
I
it.
don't either. And my wife works in higher education, and
Mm-hmm.
she's director of the Center on Learning and Teaching. And AI,
She's right in
how
it.
that's going to impact learning and teaching, and how it's going to impact things like term papers and you know
It already has, I'm sure. I
totally
mean, people are using
it
it.
has, yeah. and
Yeah.
and you look and you go, um, I think that Google was one of the real leaders in this for a long time. And I think it was just in the New York Times this morning that when Microsoft came out with their challenge to Google, they have a search engine that incorporates more AI features. That
Mm-hmm.
it's more of a talking thing than a printing thing or whatever it might be. And I've seen examples of it, and it's mind numbing what the thing can do. But they said when that happened, Google had up until that point sort of said, we need to be very cautious about what kind of products we are releasing in terms of AI, because at the end of the day, the
Yes.
question is, do we know how to control these things? And do we know
Right.
that they'll be utilized for positive purposes? And I'm sure you've seen this thing where, you know, ChatGPT can write term papers, or even worse, it
Oh, I
can,
use it.
yeah,
Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
okay, well,
Because it's addictive. It's addictive. Like
I'm
it's
sure
just
it is.
like it's because the things that you don't need to spend time on, you can stop, you can automate that and go be creative in something else.
Right.
So,
But you can
but
also use it for ill purposes as well, right? And
definitely, oh,
yeah,
there's so much
and so
concern about that.
for any product that comes out there's that much of a breakthrough. There's always people who see all the positive things that we can do with it, and a lot of people who see the negative things. And in the
Right.
political environment we operate in right now, it feels like there's an awful lot of room for this to be misused, and the
Oh,
kids are
I
going to
think
be they're going to be the recipients of that
mm-hmm.
misuses. So
Yeah.
it's a scary
Well,
time.
we're have our businesses talking about it yet
I'm
though, or is it
sure
because we're so new, but like it hasn't come up in your interaction yet with
it
them?
has come
I
up
mean,
as one of the trends that's going to impact both human
Mm-hmm.
resources, and the people who work in workplaces. It's not an issue we've attacked yet, but or really addressed yet, because it is so new. But it's going to have implications for everything. And business is certainly always at the forefront of saying, how do we make sure
Right.
that if we're utilizing this, it's not going to, you know, it just,
Destroy us.
abuse it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, literally. I mean, quite
But I mean, it
literally.
could have also a very, very big effect on the workplace. I mean, you go into a McDonald's
Yes.
now, and there's like nobody working at McDonald's. There's just these, what do they
Buttons.
call those things where you kind of go up and you just punch in what you want?
Oh, really? You order yourself now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't been in
Oh,
one
you
in.
haven't seen that? Well, that's because you
Well,
eat
I.
healthy, Deb. If you ate like
Well,
me,
it's
you'd
just because
eat.
I don't eat hamburgers. I don't eat meats.
Okay, well,
But yeah, I haven't been there in a
when
while. But
when you go to this kiosk, they call it, I guess, and you punch in what you want, and there's
hmm
somebody there who pushes it out to you. But as far as like, people,
oh,
oh, if you go to
yeah,
even if you go to a grocery store, right? And these are
sure.
pretty low tech things where everybody's on self service now. But I think a lot of these robots and certainly the AI stuff is going to really raise questions about what kind of jobs are going to be lost as a result of this.
I'm wondering when the areas that you have done these reports in, which are around, we talked about it, women and LGBTQ and fathers and race and diversity, inclusion, and all these things that companies are trying to do better in, I guess, and accommodate. Are you seeing that as actually, I'm looking at some notes that I wrote down about the C-suite and who's made it to the C-suite. So just talking about, women and people of color. I mean, the numbers are dismal still.
Absolutely do.
And so
Yeah.
I'm so curious because I know you're very sensitive to these things and
Mhm.
you're really progressive. And do you feel like there's been like all this work on diversity and inclusion, which I was doing in the 90s, has it done anything to actually elevate people of color and everyone who doesn't fit into
Yeah.
the white male stereotype?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely done some things. I mean, there's been certainly a lot of progress in terms of, persons of color, for example, being at top schools, getting, degrees and being able to parlay those into great careers. When I think about women, I mean, one of the problems is not that, women now make up 60% of the college graduates in the United States and 60% of the master's degrees. So they are really the labor market. They're the people that are really coming out of schools with great degrees, with good credentials, excellent GPAs, and so they start off their career really at a bit of an advantage over men coming out of school these days. But
But
it's an old story, though. They progress.
it isn't a
They progress until they have children, and then when they have children, there is a plateauing that occurs for women, and that's almost always the result of the fact that they have interrupted career paths, right? So that's where the differences begin, because they take time off, 2, 3, 4 months with their child. In some countries, they take 6 months or a year off with a child. And then when they come back to the workplace, they still have the lion's share of caregiving responsibilities as well. And, so what you see happening is women at professional levels, great. Women at first level, great. Manager level, great. Partner level or vice president level, less great. CEO level, because both the women themselves are having to pull back because of the fact that they are having the sort of two careers going at
mm-hmm.
the same time, one at home and one at the workplace. But also, I think there's a lot of assumptions, that are made by senior executives, men, saying, well, if she has children, then obviously she can't be as committed to her career as
So that is still the
yeah.
thinking
Well,
because
that's
women are
why this,
having fewer children and families are having fewer children. You
yeah,
would think like one and two and often none. So does
yeah,
that really explain all of it? I guess.
explains a lot of it. If you
Yeah.
look at
I
why
mean, I
women,
know,
yeah,
haven't gone through it. I
yeah,
know I know
yeah,
what it takes. You can't
yeah,
pretend that it's not happening. You
yeah,
shouldn't pretend that it's
yeah.
not happening. But
Yeah, and one of the reasons I study fathers, Debbie, is because partly I want obviously men to have as rich and full a life as possible and enjoy all the benefits of being a parent. But also a real major reason is because if fathers don't understand this simple and yet, elusive problem of shared caregiving, then women are never going to reach parity. They may
Oh,
never,
I
you know what I
appreciate
mean?
that.
So
Yeah.
fathers play a critical role in terms of saying, is this really going to be an egalitarian relationship? And if so, what are the things we can do to ensure that happens? Because we, in our studies, and we've done a lot of them on fathers, as you mentioned, 2/3 to 70% of the fathers say, I want to be an egalitarian caregiver with my wife.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we say, well, are you? About half that number say yes. And there's a lot of sort of subtle gendered
Sure.
reasons that exist. But one thing companies are doing, for example, is now they're expanding paid parental leave. I think everybody in the country, who's watching these issues realizes that waiting for the federal government to come up with
Right.
a parental leave policy,
Not
it's
going to
like,
happen.
yeah, waiting for Godot. It's not going to happen.
No.
So what a lot of our corporate members have said is we're going to expand paid parental leave for mothers, and we're going to make it gender equitable for fathers. So we've got companies we work with that are giving 3 or 4 months or more sometimes to dads, to be at-home caregivers for a period of time after they have children, and they're being given 100% replacement pay, which is very unusual.
Wow. And
Yeah,
are they
and so
doing it?
yes,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, men some men may be thick, but when you say, okay, listen to this, you can spend 3 months with your new child and you get
Yeah.
100% pay to do it. Men kind of go, okay, maybe
So
I'll.
they are, I mean, no, but some
Yeah,
people don't, before there was an excuse, if you needed it, I got to get back to work. I
right,
don't want to stay home with a crying baby, like just
right,
to be real world about it.
right.
There
So
must be,
yeah, what seems to be happening now in our research is that when men are given this, very generous package, well, not necessarily generous by the world standards, but by American standards,
right,
what's
right,
happening is a lot of women will stay home for the first couple of months or 3 months with their child, where they're the primary caregiver, and then rather than have the child then at that young age go to some kind of daycare center or whatever it
right.
might be, or in-home daycare, the father will then say, okay, I'll take over and I'll spend the next
Mm-hmm.
3 months as the at-home
Yeah,
caregiver. And we think that parental leave, it's first of all, it's a critical statement on the part of the organizations to say
it
we
is.
we really do believe that men should be caregivers and life should be equitable. But it's
Mm-hmm.
also, I think, a critical time because in the early studies when we were looking at this and men were given 2 to 3 days or a week off, you'd say, okay, a mom's going to spend 3 months at home with the child and the dad's going to spend 3 days at home with the child. And when the dad's there for the 3 days, guess what, the mother and the mother-in-law are there as well. And so the father's like running errands or whatever.
Sleeping.
But
Yeah.
sleep, well, no, well, come on, you can't be skeptical about men. That's you're better.
New babies.
But
I'm just saying what I would probably do. No.
yeah, but and so you go, did this father who spent 2 or 3 days, did he ever learn really anything about what it means to be a caregiver for a newborn? And
Mm-hmm.
B, does he see himself as even being in the position to do that, or is it just something like he just defers to his spouse? And I think that what happens then
Yeah.
is that has a sort of a self-fulfilling effect in the sense that I haven't really spent time doing it. The baby doesn't look to me. They always look to their mother you know,
Yep.
and I don't have much confidence in my ability to be competent at delivering
Yeah.
that. So there's
Yeah.
a cycle that occurs there that just keeps mothers as the primary caregivers and fathers on the outside looking
Yeah.
in.
It's a tough thing to change.
It is, and I think parental leave for dads, where they're at home flying solo with being a caregiver, is one of the
Right.
best things that can happen to get men into the mindset of this is what it means to be a caregiver, A, and B, I'm competent to do this, right?
Just reinforcing the thing I said at the very beginning of the podcast, which is business can drive social change so much faster than anyone else. And
Yep.
this is a great example. I just wanted to spread out of these, progressive companies
Yep.
into, and a lot of it's hard for small businesses to do it, to have the funding to do it. So that's always the rub, I think, when you get down to the small
It
business,
really
because
is, and
most
that
businesses are
yeah.
small,
And companies
otherwise.
that are in very low wage environments, it's tough for them sometimes because they have very low margins. And that's where, government policy is going to be necessary. But the
Right.
federal government isn't going to figure that out. It seems it's going to be the states
State
that
by
figure it
state.
out. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the
And
problem
some
too is
states are going to be horrible to work in, and some will be great, you
correct.
know,
And that goes, I mean,
just
when talking about the
with
whole range of
everything.
issues we're dealing with, that goes also
Right.
for women's, health care in terms of the right to choose and
Correct.
reproductive health
Right.
care. One of the things that's kind of an interesting thing that's happened is in the interest of costs, a lot of companies have moved their corporate headquarters out of places like California, and they move their headquarters to places like Texas and Florida, right? Why? Because it's cheaper, cost of labor is
Right.
lower and stuff.
Because
And,
of taxes too.
and
Yeah.
so a big chunk of their employee population has moved to these,
Hmm.
what are really red states.
Oh.
And then what happened when the ruling came down was a year ago when Roe v. Wade was overturned. A
Yeah.
lot of these states all of a sudden is like, okay, we want to uh, provide women reproductive health care. But guess what? A lot of these women are now working in states where, that's
You
being
can't get it.
correct. And so, believe it or not, I mean, speaks to the strength of the companies. Obviously, when they moved these jobs to Texas, they weren't thinking, well, this will be good because it could
Of
hinder women's
course.
reproductive rights. That wasn't
Right.
even on but a
Wasn't
lot
on
of
anyone's radar.
right, it wasn't on anybody's radar. But what's happened as a result is a lot of these companies have said, we will pay for you to go to state. I mean, not that this is a complete solution, but we'll pay for you to go to states to have medical procedures done, and we'll pay your not only for the procedures to be done through your health insurance, but we'll also pay for your travel and your stay costs because you're working in a state that just isn't amenable. But again,
Interesting.
these are
Until they
well,
make that illegal, because there are states that are wanting to make it illegal for anyone who
absolutely,
helps a woman leave the
absolutely.
state. So,
But that's
yeah,
where
that it's
that's where businesses have more common sense than than
the
state
government.
legislatures.
Yeah,
And
and I where I thought you were headed with that, which I hadn't thought about before, was just all the like someone bringing a company of more progressive thinkers from California to Texas and to Florida. That eventually that's going to seep out into the social, who's being elected and
yeah,
and what's going to happen
yeah.
socially.
Well,
So
you
it's
can
good.
see, yeah, some of these states are turning purple. Georgia obviously
Hmm.
turned
Yeah,
blue, really, and
yeah,
I think
yeah.
that's a lot of a result of large employers
Companies.
who are in states like that who are
Interesting.
saying, yeah, and and in that way, I think, business is very pragmatic. It's like they don't, certainly there are conservative businesses run by conservative people and some run by liberal people, but the overarching ideology of business is how do we get things done, right? And how can we
Of
be
course, that's
practical?
what that's
Right,
what they're there for in the first
right.
place.
And part of that
Yeah.
is how do we respond to employees' needs? And if we feel like, for example, I remember a few years ago, um, in Indiana, and I'm trying to remember if this was maybe when Pence was. It was after he was the governor of Indiana, but Indiana came down and said, they passed laws of, about limiting the rights of LGBTQ people. And all of a sudden, guess what? Eli Lilly and some of the other companies, excuse me, that were based there said, and all of a sudden the NCAA pulled out the tournament and said, we're not going to have the tournament in Indianapolis.
Yes.
And when
Forgotten
businesses
that.
and organizations respond like that, then, guess what?
They make
State
change.
legislatures, start to sit up and listen because they don't want business and I think for the most part, and you can see this playing out in Florida loudly between DeSantis
Hmm.
and Disney. I mean, Disney
Hmm.
is not considered a flaming liberal company. I mean, it's I mean, the history of Disney is not there, and yet
Yeah.
they're complete odds with this guy because he's pushing an agenda
Hmm.
that they view to be
Does
anti
not represent them at all. Yeah.
right, and so.
Yeah.
Disney is, DeSantis his voice is gonna be interesting because nobody in Florida wants to lose hundreds of thousands of jobs.
This is really, actually, you're giving me a lot of hope because even more than, and a better maybe opinion about big business because as long as the ones that are really really thinking about people, if they can put the focus back on individuals and back on the human and influence government, then I think there's some hope there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah,
You just have to keep that going, and you're honestly doing your part to make that happen.
I'm
So
trying. I mean, to have an anti-corporate stance to me is not only naive, it's destructive. I mean, what I
it's
like
just
is when people say, "How do we get companies to sit up and pay attention to the issues that are
hmm
important to us?" And that could be race issues or LGBTQ issues or environmental issues or women's rights. I think
absolutely.
we should never
Yeah.
stop lobbying and being activists to say, how do we get organizations to do the right thing? But to just sit there and bash corporations and say they're all about money and they don't care about, I mean, I think that's a very sort of naive perspective. And I think
Right.
it doesn't do much to really advance, what the good causes are that businesses
Yeah,
have a big influence
but
on.
I think it does depend because we do vote with our dollars, right? So
Yep.
if we're seeing companies that aren't following the social constructs that we support, then definitely you don't have to bash them. Just take your money elsewhere so
Right.
you can be a quiet protest.
Yeah.
Is
If
there
if
just
we vote in that way, Debbie, as long as we don't say, well, I know these guys aren't very environmentally responsible, but God, I can get a T-shirt from them for half the price of some other company.
no,
So we have to
right?
be able to say that we really do vote, and that we are willing to absorb additional costs, as a result of working with companies that are trying to do the right thing.
Absolutely. Just buy a T-shirt that has plastic in it that's not biodegradable. It's a lot cheaper than buying a pure 100% cotton
Absolutely.
biodegradable. It's true in everything else, in our food and all
Absolutely.
throughout the system.
Right.
Well, we're pretty much at the end of the
Yeah.
hour, but I just want to ask you, like, what if there is one thing that you don't see companies doing now, or corporations doing, or the workforce in general doing, that you wish there would be more of? Is there some area that you just haven't been able to see progress that you wish you could, or change you could make if you could?
Debbie, I thought I was going to make it through the entire hour without a question to
Without
the
a
company, and now here we are.
without
No, I'm kidding.
Well,
But
yeah,
the one thing
I can cut it off at an hour and cut
no,
out this
no,
part,
that's
but
okay. The one thing
just
that I've
kidding.
always been amazed by, and this may sound trivial to you, but has been organizations' fervent commitment to full-time employees, and that's it. In other words, like, if you're looking
Mm,
for a full-time job, there's obviously lots of them going unfilled in this day and age. But if somebody, and I'll say a parent, although it's oftentimes more often the mom than the dad, says, I would like to go back to work, but I have other
mm-hmm,
responsibilities, and I'd like to work a 3-day week in a professional position. It's
mm-hmm.
unbelievable how difficult it is to find
Almost
good
impossible.
part-time work.
Mm-hmm,
And I've never fully understood that because, there are so many, and again, I'm going to, go by gender. There are so many talented, educated women with great experience who are out of the workplace because they think the choice is I either stay home full time or I go to work and then I have no time
mm-hmm,
for my family. And I don't understand why organizations, given all the changes that we've been through and all the different, populations that they're trying to appeal to, I don't understand why organizations don't say, a 3-day a week person can be just as productive as somebody 5 days a week,
mm-hmm.
or maybe not just as productive, but pretty darn close. And if we allowed more people to do that, we would get more, for example, moms that stayed in touch with the workplace and didn't drop
Right.
out for 10 years and then have to sort of
Yeah.
reinvent themselves.
Yeah.
And it's a
That's a
trivial
good
thing
point.
on one level, but I would love to see.
Not at all trivial, not
Yeah,
at all trivial,
yeah,
because but I certainly wouldn't put it I mean, I know
no,
you're not saying only women, but I
no,
bet there's a lot of men who would really appreciate that,
yeah,
especially when their kids are teenagers or something and they want to be around more.
absolutely,
There's,
yeah. Or
yeah.
people who just have
Um,
not just that, but they may have some other form of caregiving responsibility or some other outside
Correct.
interest that
Parents.
they're very
Right.
committed to. And
Mm-hmm.
why does it have to be 5 days a week
A
or
penalty.
nothing? I just don't get that.
Well, I guess my answer to that would be, if I had to guess, is just that no one's demanded it. There hasn't been a loud enough demand for it,
Not yeah,
because they it may be there, but it's a quiet demand.
yeah,
So
yeah,
you got to really knock people over the head sometime.
yeah,
Brad, this has been really interesting for me, and
absolutely.
I hope for people listening too, because um, we have so far to go. But I think just talking about it and talking about how even small businesses can just try to emulate the good things that are going on in some of these more progressive corporations
Yeah,
can just make life a little bit sweeter, a little bit easier. We all need a little bit of a break. So
absolutely. Yeah,
whatever they can do. But I will definitely put those. I love the work that you're doing there, and I appreciate it so much. And I've
mhm,
definitely put um, the show notes, all the information I can, so people
right.
can get those reports from you, and maybe learn a little something. Just implement one little nice thing for your employees,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah, sure.
Make all the difference in
Absolutely.
the
Yeah.
world. It's
Okay.
lovely to see you
Nice to see
again.
you, Deb.
We'll stay in touch.
Take care.
All right. Thank you.
Yep.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.